I'm Jarrett Fuller, and welcome to Scratching the Surface. I have told friends over the years that I sometimes think my dream job is to be the director of the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum in New York. It seems museum administration in some strange way combines many of my professional interests, from design and strategy to curation and publishing and even administration and organization. So when the Smithsonian, of which the Cooper Hewitt is a part of, announced architectural historian and theorist Maria Nicanor as the new Cooper Hewitt director back in March, I knew I needed her on the show, and I'm excited to kick off the new season with this wide-ranging conversation with Maria. Before joining the Cooper Hewitt, she was the executive director of the Rice Design Alliance, part of Rice University School of Architecture in Houston, and also served as a curator in the Architecture, Design, and Digital Department at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This conversation takes place as she's just in month 6 of her new job. So we begin talking about the last half year and what she wants to do in this new position at the museum. We also talk about museums more generally and how they can foster conversation and discourse, how design is a democratic activity that can become an equalizer, and why she's animated by ideas as much as objects. We also, of course, spend time talking about the role of the museum director and what that looks like for her. If you'd prefer to read this conversation, a full transcript of my conversation with Maria is available on our Patreon. In addition to transcripts of every episode, Patreon supporters get early access to episodes, bonus interviews, and a monthly newsletter filled with book recommendations, interviews, links, and other design news. We offer 3 monthly tiers at $3 for students, $5 for members, and $10 for superfans. Scratching the Surface and much of my work is made possible through your support. So if you like what we're doing here, I hope you join us on Patreon. We have a great slate of guests lined up through the rest of the year, and you can help support that and be a part of that. You can head over to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and support the ongoing production of this show. It feels really good to be back. I'm really excited about these new episodes coming up. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I hope you enjoy this really wonderful conversation with Maria Nicanor. You've been the director of Cooper Hewitt since basically the end of March now, so six months or so. And I'm curious, when you got the job, kind of going into it, did you have a mandate, sort of either self-imposed or sort of a personal kind of goal or idea of what you wanted to do in this position? Or did the Smithsonian have something that they said, like, we want you here for this? If so, what was that? And has that changed or has that evolved over the last 6 months in this job?
Yeah, I arrived to the position, as you said, in late March, early April, and there was not a clear mandate. I have to say. I think in part because of the bizarre moment that the whole process took place. Of course, I was interviewing during the pandemic, and it was a
Right.
really long, really long process that was done remotely as well, and there wasn't a very specific mandate at that point in time, in part because a lot of the mandate is rethinking what this museum does,
Mm.
and post pandemic, and rethinking what a design institution does, and so there was a lot of opportunity there, which is what I found exciting as well, as to crafting what the mandate should be with the team here at the museum. So that part I found exciting because of the opportunity of arriving somewhere that is looking for that level of input, right? So I think part of it is just rethinking what the Cooper Hewitt is in the context of the Smithsonian, but also in a moment of profound soul searching for all museums and what we're all doing. So that was a sense of opportunity that to me was super appealing, and it wouldn't have been if it hadn't been a Smithsonian museum either, which was very appealing to me because I come from a system. I grew up in Spain. I was born in Spain and grew up there, studied there. I grew up in a system where museums are public and where that is sort of like a given, which I realize is not always the case depending on where you are. So this idea that you could join a national platform like the Smithsonian was incredibly appealing to me with the flexibility that was given to me. So I was given, and I have been given a lot of flexibility, and that's the part that I find super exciting and where I see a lot of potential.
There's so many things in that answer that I want to pick out and talk
Mm,
about more, but let's start sort of very specifically right at the beginning when you said about kind of rethinking what the Cooper Hewitt is or could be, especially in a post-pandemic world. And I want to talk about museums more generally in a bit, but
mm.
specifically at the Cooper Hewitt, what is the new Cooper Hewitt, or what is that evolution? Can you kind of talk a little bit about just the things you're thinking about,
Yeah.
and maybe even just like the role of the Cooper Hewitt today, and kind of how that's evolving?
Of course. So it's important to talk about its history, right? When answering that
Mm,
question, because I also quickly realized that it's a platform with potential because it has a good DNA to it. So it's a museum that was born in under very specific circumstances, and that's part of the story as well as to where it's going in the future. So
mm,
it's, as you know, the museum originally was part of the Cooper Union, so it was
right.
part of a school, right? And at some point, and I won't get too much into the details, but at some point the Cooper Union couldn't sustain the museum
Mm,
anymore. And there were conversations about decoupling the museum from the school and what that could look like, which meant that there was a lot of discussions about dispersing the collections and where they would go. They talked about dispersing them between the Met and other institutions in the city and other places in
mm,
the country. So that would have completely
wow.
uh, dispersed this incredible array of treasures that we now have. But ultimately, what ended up happening, making the story very short here for purposes of our conversation, but what ended up happening is that it wasn't dismantled, and the Smithsonian Institution became part of the picture, and the Carnegie Mansion on Fifth Avenue was offered as a possibility, as a possible home for this collection, which then ended up being what happened. This house, this mansion here, became the repository of that collection, which was in its origins closer to a museum of decorative arts,
Right,
right?
right.
Then, so if you think of models like the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, for example, or other national museums that were more focused on decorative arts, that was the origin of Cooper Hewitt too. But it was also founded by two women, by the Hewitt sisters, and their mandate and their idea and inspiration there was for it to be a laboratory of a museum.
Mm.
So they already started it with this notion that I think a lot of us think that we have invented in the last 10 years, and we're totally wrong. They already did it. They already thought about it. They were the first two women to found a museum. They wanted people to touch things and experiment with them, and they were using that terminology. They were calling it a lab.
Mm,
So that to me is like, what better base can I have and find that I
yeah.
can so identify with and so want to take to its next phase, right? So I think there's a lot, just like many museums have very troubled histories, and I'm in every collecting sort
Mhm,
of institution,
mhm.
that troubled history is there. But I have to say that original story of how this particular museum came to be is one that I can feel proud about in the sense of experimentation. So that's what that meant then. Experimentation then meant,
Mhm.
XYZ, and ended up in their collecting practices. What I'm interested in is what does that experimentation mean today? Like, how can we be
Ah,
of our own time to honor those ideas? But of course, that's very different in our current moment, right?
yeah.
So I think that leads to other more general ideas about what museums should be doing. But for this museum in particular, I think is maintaining that sense of experimentation is important to me. Is something that I don't want to lose. That means that there's a little bit of risk involved sometimes in the things that you do, which I hope that we can also do. So there's a lot of thoughts that I have about how I think we can be risky and experimental and even a bit provocative in the things that we do moving forward. But I'm still very conscious that we are a mansion. We call ourselves a mansion. We're a gated mansion on Fifth
Right,
Avenue,
right, right.
so therein lie the challenges. But again, this DNA to me means a lot, and I hope that we can take it to its next phase.
This is perhaps a kind of personal question that I was not planning on asking you, but hearing you say that, I'm kind of curious if you have any, I don't know the word, I'm going to say sort of like conflict, and I don't,
Hmm.
that's a strong word for what I'm trying to say, but sort of within the Smithsonian, even the Cooper Hewitt itself, those are names, those are reputations, those are institutions. And I'm wondering sort of how you think about reconciling or balancing or playing with the tension between kind of maintaining that while also
Hmm.
being experimental. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. I don't think I have a
Mm,
conflict with that, because I think there's a certain sense of honesty in trying to translate what all of these individuals, they were people, right? Like you
mm,
and me, they
mhm,
had their
mhm.
ideas, they have their subjective opinions on what they were doing in the time and their biases and everything. But I think we keep it honest if we try to understand, again, what they were trying to do at the time. And I think the intent could be the same, with different results coming out of it, so I think
Right,
it's that intent that we have to try and honor in a certain way. But also, quite frankly, I think we can also fix some of the wrongs in the past, and it's our responsibility to do it as well. So
right,
not that I'm focusing and looking at what those wrongs were, but I would want to use the mansion as a tool of subversion, quite
right,
honestly,
right,
to turn around this sort of like more gilded age concepts of like what of the makers of taste sitting up here uptown in Carnegie Hill. So those
right.
things, I do want to change, and those things I think are important that we address and that we turn in their head a little bit. And I think that's doable through the way that you program, through the conversations that you pick to channel, through the exhibitions and the programs and the publications that we do. So I think that maintains the honesty and the intent, and I don't think is disrespectful. It's just an evolution of where that initial model is going towards, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of subversion there in that answer. And I've heard you talk a lot about in other interviews about how you kind of see design as an equalizer in a lot
Mm,
of ways. And that's very much my kind of view of design also. And I think in some ways that has become a sort of radical view of design
mm,
in kind of today's culture when design is seen as a divider. Even in sort of popular culture, design it sort
sure.
of connotes elitism.
Mm.
And I'm wondering sort of, how you are thinking about that design project of subverting the idea of the museum and then in turn subverting our ideas of design. So that was a big question, you know
Oh,
what I
no,
mean?
but I know exactly what you mean, and I would say that I would strongly challenge the idea of design as an elitist
Mhm.
slash
Right.
luxury concept, and I would strongly challenge it, saying that I think everybody's invested in design and everybody's an expert
Mhm.
in design in their own way. So and that's why what I mean when I talk about design being the
Yeah.
great equalizer, because
Yeah.
everybody wakes up in the morning. Everybody sets foot on a street of some sort. They've been living in some sort of space of some sort. They're having some sort of interaction with some sort of medium of transportation. There might be in a rural area. There might be in a more urban area. But they know if they are feeling comfortable walking down the street. They know if when they open that door creaks, is comfortable to hold or not. They know if the subway that they're getting on
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
working that morning or not. All of those are design systems, right? All of those, everything. You're making your coffee, the
Right.
coffee pot, everything has been in some way touched by design. So everyone can have an opinion about it. And I would hope that we can help people see things that way. So see design as that. So I very much think that that's almost like the role of this museum in a way, is to
Yeah.
help everybody, every citizen, think of it. And I say it as a citizen because it's important that we think of people as citizens. Every citizen has a different way of looking, and I think we can at least um, try and help how we look at things, and try and help understand what's behind all of those systems that you're touching on a daily basis and that you actually have some agency in,
Right.
right? So when
Right.
you understand those things, you have some agency as to wanting to change them or improve them or leaving them as they are.
Right.
But you are an expert in that, because you might not be an expert in I don't know, in a Kandinsky painting, but you are an expert in understanding how you navigate through the built environment, right?
Right.
So that's how I think you can, we reach, and we should reach people, because everybody has an opinion about what design is.
I mean, you had this great line, and I'm sorry, I'm about ready to quote to you an answer that you gave in another interview. But when Fast Company interviewed you when you first took the role, you have this line where you said, "I want to make sure people know that talking about food systems is design, talking about
Mm,
infrastructure bill is design, talking about housing prices is design. These are all systems that are directly affected by design thinking processes." And when I read that, I was like, "Yes, that is exactly right. I want more people talking about design that way."
mm,
And I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on that a little bit. And I think, this idea that we're all living in these designed environments and that these systems are all designed in some way.
mm.
Do you think as a visitor to the museum, or as a participant in those conversations about housing prices as design, i- is design is it important for non-designers to see that as design, or is design more a lens to make it actionable or relatable? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I think I do. I So I think all of these processes that create the built environment that we're in are not neutral, right?
Right.
They're not neutral. Someone has had a hand at them, for good or for bad. Um, I would like people to understand that, right? And I think people do, but I think that's part of, like, the message is, like, you're operating in a universe that's not neutral.
Right.
Someone has thought about it, and so I think that's an important concept. And then there's another idea that has to do with design thinking, which is not really the same as design, but it's about the methodology of and a way of thinking, as
Mm-hmm.
which I think applies more to the kinds of systems that you just described. So, the food chain, the infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
bill. One thing is to design a thing, an object, and the other thing is to apply design thinking. And I think, to
Mm.
me, the what's interesting about design thinking is that you're showing, or you're making visible to people, the process in which all of these systems are being built and
Right.
and made, and how they work in a very I'm a very logical person. So I like to see how one leads to two, and two leads to three, and three
Right.
to four, and how that builds a whole entire very complex system. So I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but this
Yeah.
notion of non-neutrality, and of people having a hand at it, and just thinking of those of process, and what it means to design a system for somebody, and how that affects you directly, is something that I would want to make more visible for everybody.
I think the way you said that is so right too, about sort of the value of design thinking processes is that it makes the process visible. I think is really well said, and is not articulated in that way very often. I think
Mm,
one of the downsides of design thinking that I see sort of in like an academic context is that it centers the designer in everything. And so when I talk about food systems being designed, or the infrastructure bill being designed, um that's not design as colonizing, as saying designers can do everything. It's actually design as democratizing, as saying we're all designing
Exactly,
this
but you
system.
just yes, and you just put your finger on it. It's not about that person having the power as the designer. It's about acknowledging that the
Right.
jobs of many people, the jobs and the thinking processes, there's so many more people out there
Right.
that are designers without perhaps ever, being someone who would self-describe themselves as a designer. And, I think you were focusing your previous question around the word design,
Yeah.
and I think that can be contentious, and we can get as many definitions of design
Right.
as
Right.
podcast interviewees that you've had in the podcast, right? But I I don't always use the word design. In the last few years of my career, I've been working
Hmm.
in an architecture school, and I gravitated towards, and I just generalized and used the word architecture to describe the same exact concepts
Right.
that we're
Right.
describing, when I'm not just talking about architects, right? So I think there's a fluidity of terms there that has to do with all the different fields that fall within the design disciplines, or that have design thinking in their methodology, or that have a design as an output to what they do. And that's certainly a new way of thinking for me, because I'm an architectural historian. I like thinking about architecture and urban planning. That's sort of like my thing. But now I am responsible for so many other fields that fall under the definition of design in the context of the Cooper Hewitt, right?
Right.
I'm not an expert in fashion, for example, but that certainly falls into the larger umbrella of when I use the term design now. So I have to be careful myself when I use it
Yeah.
when I use the term design. So I think it's an all-encompassing term that can be very misused as well.
Yeah.
But I just honestly I have a pretty expansive understanding of what design can be, right? So
Right.
I
Right.
don't always want to assume that everybody sees it the same way, but I think it's important to set the tone of the conversation that we want to have here at the Cooper Hewitt by saying that not only is everybody a designer, but also what design means is very different to very many different people.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what I was getting at with that first question, where it's like, how important is that word design in there, or is it about these
Mm,
systems, which I think you sort of said,
mm,
really well. Something else I've heard you say before is that you're very much driven by ideas rather than objects, and I'm curious how that manifests itself both in a place like a Cooper Hewitt, but also in a museum where objects are
mm.
often so central. How do you start to either kind of equalize the ideas and the objects, or start to give the ideas a bigger prominence in a sort of institution like you're in?
That's a great question, because and I think about it a lot in the context of the museum now, also having spent some years outside of museums, which was incredibly refreshing. And then really fantastic to come back into it, having sort of like been on the other side, right? Without
Yeah.
without the objects. So um the objects have been the anchor for museums, right, for centuries. And and I see the value of the collection that we have here. So we have this incredible breadth of a very broad definition of what design is and how it's manifested in objects. What I'm interested in the object and the beauty of the object, and I'm fascinated by how things are made as well. So that's
Mm.
something that really
Hmm.
appeals to me. But I'm also really interested in the objects as conversation starters, and I think that's maybe where we connect the two things that you were just alluding to: the object with the idea,
Right.
and the larger kind of thinking. So can we take those objects and absolutely revel in the wonderfulness that of their materiality, but also hook them to what idea it is that they are representing. And
Mm.
I think I had a great professor when I was studying architectural and design thinking at the university in Madrid that could that started that the survey of that year by telling us that we could pick whatever object, just give him an object, and he would lecture the whole entire year around that object.
Mm.
And that always stuck with me, because
Wow.
you can pick up a pen, and then just starting from the pen, just tell the history of the world from that one object. So that's where it
Right.
connects it to the larger history of thinking. That's where you can extrapolate from material culture into trends in society, into how different societies view that object throughout time, the
Hmm.
importance. So I think that's, I guess what I'm saying is like the objects can be conversation starters. And can you start a conversation without an object? Yes, you can, but isn't it so much better
Right.
if you can look at a couple of objects and interconnect them and tell a story? And that, so it has to do with storytelling, which is another part that I'm very interested in, and choosing what way you tell your stories through, what formats you tell your stories
Right.
through. Right? You have found this great format that is the podcast, and that's how you excel at telling stories. And but there are so many other ways of telling stories that
Hmm.
can combine that, right? And for me, I've happened to sort of like land and choose museums as my medium to tell stories, and that often comes connected to the object. So
Yeah.
it's I think that's the two-way sort of like dialogue that happens between ideas and objects.
I want to sort of expand that question a bit because I was thinking about you and thinking about this conversation and thinking about sort of museums in a post pandemic world. And you started speaking to this in that answer. I'm kind of curious, in sort of contemporary culture, this question sounds like it's a challenge, like I'm challenging you, and I promise I'm not. But how is the museum the best forum for discussing these big ideas? Or what is it about museums that can help foster these types of conversations?
Hmm. I don't think museums have always been the best channel for some of those conversations. And I think what we are all in the midst of discussing right now is around, I'm going to choose to say the word formats. It's about
Mm,
formats of how um, and how we need to change the different formats that museums have appropriated for many years to tell those stories, precisely to be able to say that we are a good that we are a good place to tell those stories. We haven't been for many years. That it hasn't been the right medium. It hasn't even been sometimes the right story to tell, or
mhm,
through the right objects, right? So I think what many museums are rethinking right now is, I mean, there's this sort of like whole existential crisis about whether we are. So I think your question speaks to that. I think we're all struggling with that,
yeah,
and what it is that we should do or not. And I think we have to become, not do less than what we were doing before, but perhaps expand our definition of what we could do, and
mm,
reach more people through different formats. Let's say that different people learn in different ways, right?
yeah,
And you can learn a lot from listening to a podcast, and you can learn a lot from seeing an exhibition or going to a symposium. But sometimes you can learn a lot from going to a party, or you can learn a lot
mm,
from playing, or you can,
right,
right? There's all these different formats. Museums have only used a couple of those in very rigid ways throughout their history. So I think we can open up the walls of museums and expand our activities to not just try and be one thing. I think we
yeah,
have to try, and I mean, as I speak to you, I'm looking down through my window at the garden of the Cooper Hewitt, and I would like to see this garden full of activity,
right,
and not necessarily with a symposium around design. I want to see people playing down here,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And opening up the museum to, I hate to use the like the community hub kind of idea again, but that's sort of like what I'm going towards, is like these places can have other uses. An example that I think is useful is when you go to vote, you go to vote to a public school, right?
mhm,
And no one questions the fact that voting happens in a school.
mm,
Why does voting happen in a school? You do other things in
right,
school, but
right,
they very smartly thought of a system where actually you exercise your right to vote in a public school system, in a building that is
yeah,
built for a public use, or of education of citizens. So I can't think of a better match than that. So
yeah,
other uses that museums could be thinking about, that we could be helpful too. And again, it doesn't have to be through the kinds of programming that we've done in the past. They can be completely different formats, open also to collaborations with others. So it's not just what we say and doing what we do, but it's joining forces with others that already do what they do really well to invite them to do that together. So I think playing with others, with other organizations, with other groups of people that might be doing things that are not necessarily identifying as design is important too. So yeah, I think just changing the kinds of things we do within the walls of the museum and quite frankly outside of them is kind of crucial to that question.
Yeah, I have a two-part question that's sort of about audience. And
Yeah.
and it seems to me that Cooper Hewitt has a couple different audiences that it is communicating to. It's communicating to the city of New York. It is very much a New York museum. It is a museum for non-designers to learn about design. And I don't mean to like separate non-designer and
Yeah, yeah,
designer,
yeah.
especially considering our conversation so far,
Hmm.
but you know what I mean. But then it's
Hmm.
also a museum for designers to go and, you know, see their work and the work of
Mm.
their peers and that sort of thing. And I'm curious how you think about those different levels or like those different sectors of the audience. And then the second part of the question is kind of Cooper Hewitt's position in the design world. And I'm curious how you think the museum can help set the agenda of design today or define the terms of the conversation, which is something that we've kind of been talking about here.
Yeah.
With the position of the museum in the design world, how can it kind of do that while also, you know, kind of speaking outside of the profession?
I think you're on point asking about audiences. And we are a New York museum. And then you described it as a museum for non-designers and a museum for designers. So I'll challenge your poke
Yeah,
there.
I know. I knew that was coming.
That's okay. And that makes me think harder. So we're a New York museum, but we're also a national museum, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean to be a museum that needs to be deeply rooted in its locality and what that locality is and what that audience is, and what does it mean to be a museum that is supposed to speak to the whole entire nation
Right,
and
right.
ideas of what design should be for the country. So mm, I think there's those two notions which are interesting, which is where I think that notion of appealing to non-designers, to people that are curious thinkers that want to learn about processes that affect their interactions with the world around them. I think that's something that we can help do at a local and at a national level.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you need to. I'm going to go back to my answer of formats. We have to offer uh, diverse enough range of topics of conversations, so that if you want to approach the museum through a very superficial way, you can do that if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to dig deeper, if you are that professional quote unquote designer who is interested in like a deeper dive in what we have to offer, we have to make sure that those layers are there for you as well. And I think that connects to the position of the museum in the design world. So
Right.
if we're doing our job right, I think we should be a part of many conversations that are happening right now around what the definitions of design are, and if we should be engaging with the kinds of professionals that are having those conversations as well. We should be engaging with academia and the researchers that
Mm-hmm.
are kind of redefining what areas are most important for the country right now for designers and design thinkers to be addressing. And so I think we become relevant when we offer a point of view, and
Mm.
offering a point of view is also connected to a notion of the expert perhaps, and should experts be telling audiences what to think, and quote unquote educate them. This is a
Right,
big sort
right,
of like big bad word, right?
right.
um, I think there's a lot of value in expertise, and having experts in any particular field is not a bad thing. And it's a bad thing when experts are not open to feedback. It's a bad thing when
Right.
experts are not being porous as to their thinking and when that expertise is coming top down. That's not a
Right.
model of expertise
Exactly.
that I am interested in or
Right.
that I would like to foster. But I value the expertise of people who know things about other areas of the world that I don't know anything about, right?
Hmm.
And I want that point of view. So I think we have to not be afraid of having a point of view as well. I think there's a lot of I think we're perhaps a little too focused on this notion of like, what do people want? What do
Right.
people want, and what should we give them because it's what they want? Sure, I think there's a lot of understanding your audience and being much more open to that feedback, and there's correct processes to get that and to understand who we're talking to and who's interested in following what we do. But I think it's disingenuous to think that openness means that you're giving people what they want.
Right.
And I think you lose the point of view there. And we all have a point of view. We're all people. We all have our own opinions. And just trying to say that you're being objective by offering
Right.
it's a fallacy. This
Right.
is only
Right.
not true. But I take issue with
Yeah,
when
totally.
people
Me too. Yeah.
when they say that, because it's not true. And but it's certainly, there was a cover of Time magazine. I don't have the year at hand, but where the main person in the cover of the magazine said, you are the
Oh,
main
yeah, I
person,
remember this. Yeah.
right? And I can't I'm going to get the year wrong. I don't remember if it was the 90s or before, or but and that is so representative of this sort of like fallacy of the participation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think there's true deep participatory processes and there's fake participatory processes, and I don't want to be anywhere close to fake participatory
Yeah.
processes, because they don't help anybody. So I defend the
Uh,
expert of the notion of the open-minded expert that is willing to change their
that's right.
mind, for
That's right.
sure. And I defend the having a point of view as well. I don't think it's disrespectful. So I hope that's something that we can utilize when we choose about what we want to talk about, right? It's sort of like you and I
Right.
having a conversation today. What do we want to talk about? Well,
Right.
that's the same kind of things that we're thinking at the museum. What do we want to talk about with people today and in the next year or 2 years, right? And defining what those topics are, I think is very important. It's very important that we define what those are so that we can add to those conversations in fruitful ways.
There's a difference between having a point of view and being dogmatic. You
Yeah,
can
of
have a point
course.
of view that is
Yeah,
generative and
yeah,
inviting, as
yeah.
opposed to a point of view that shuts off the conversation, which I think is, historically, and this is a blanket
Historically,
statement,
yes,
how museums have often sort of treated their collections and their
exactly,
ideas. I mean,
exactly.
this
Yeah.
conversation has been very philosophical so far, and and as I said to you before we started recording, in many ways, I feel like you kind of have my dream job. And at the Cooper Hewitt, on the website, it says that you manage 86 employees and an annual budget of $50 million and a collection of 215,000 objects. And I'm wondering sort of what you see as your role as director. And so taking
Mm,
all of this that we're talking about and actually kind of practically, how do you enact these in your role as director? How do you support the audience? How do you support the curators? How do you start to kind of foster these conversations?
mm. Well, first, one day I'm going to invite you to come and experience the beauties of the federal
Yes,
system
I
of the
can't wait.
American
Can't
government,
wait.
and then you might change your statement.
I'm an aspiring bureaucrat until I get into the system.
So there's a lot of that going on, but I'm a generalist,
Mhm.
and I did study to be an expert, but I found that I am better at bigger picture things
Mm,
and at remaining a generalist. So I
mm.
say that with a lot of pride.
Mhm, mhm.
And, I've done all the classic kind of like training to be a design and architecture curator, an academic. I've taught, I've been a faculty and universities and all those things. But, but my role here is a much bigger picture role of looking at the structures that enable for those conversations to
Right.
happen.
Mhm.
There's a great team of people here at the Cooper Hewitt. They're all experts in their own areas, which I'm not just referring to curators that have content expertise, but we have experts in storytelling, experts in
Mm,
video making,
mhm.
experts in producing exhibitions, experts in packing objects and restoring them and conserving them. So there's no lack of expertise in the museum. So I see my role as number one, being able to create in a very practical way the physical infrastructure that allows for all of that to flourish and to happen. And I think there's a great deal of creativity in the administrative part of those
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
So I was talking the other day with a dear old colleague, and we both really wanted to talk about our org chart, and we got all excited about org charts, and organizing things at that level, I think, has a
Yeah,
great level of satisfaction of knowing that you're giving people the tools they need to do their better and their best at their jobs, right? And what they need to be doing. And then, quite frankly, I'm fascinated, and I would love to have a role here in talking to everyone and all of the teams about what the content of those conversations needs to be. So when you were referencing before the food systems, the infrastructure bill, the housing crisis, I know those are things that our teams here are interested in.
mhm.
So I think we just have to give ourselves permission to do that,
Yeah,
and perhaps I can play a role in that, in giving ourselves permission to change, to use the mansion in different ways, to have different kinds of conversations here, to invite different people to come and visit us, to have those conversations with us that might not have thought that this was a place for them to have them. So if I can be an enabler for those things to happen, I'll be happy enough,
mhm, mhm.
happy enough with it. But I think that's probably the way that I see my role, and it's just creating the conditions for that to happen, and encouraging people to have a point of view, and to
Right.
getting the best people here to tell those stories.
You started answering this already when you were talking about kind of the creativity in administration and kind of gushing about org charts. And I always joke that my favorite design tool is the spreadsheet. Um, do you see sort of organizations and administration as a type of design project?
Oh yes, yes, and I think that's a part of it that I actually find very, very, very satisfying. Also, because as well as making possible all the things that I just said, I care deeply about creating a place of work. In this case, it's a design museum, but
Mm,
where people really want to come and work. And I say this, I don't say this superficially. I've been in a lot of institutions. I've lost my faith in institutions along the way more than
yeah,
once.
yeah.
And I've seen terrible things happen in museums.
Right.
And, I don't want to repeat any of that. And I want to make sure that we, that we have an environment here that challenges all of that. And I want to be able to innovate also in how we're doing all of this. So it's not just doing
Mm,
it and then just
mhm,
burning ourselves to death to do
mhm.
it, because I wouldn't be satisfied with that either. I think it's, and the time is right for a variety of historical and world order reasons, I suppose, to change the way that you do it too, right? So I see, at least I have hope in that we can infuse institutions with better practices if
Hmm.
we also pay attention to how we do it and not just like the what you're doing. So that, I talked to a lot of colleagues about that, and I think there's such a hunger for that change to happen, and I see it
Yeah,
happening around us. And if we can make the Cooper Hewitt a place that can also innovate and be a leader in that, I that would make me extremely happy.
I love that. I have one more sort of big question for you. You've mentioned a couple times in this conversation your background in art history and architecture history and theory, and one of my interests is sort of the overlap or intersection or balance between administration and scholarship and how
Mm.
those start to kind of feed each other. And I'm curious if you could just speak about that in your own work, sort of how that background and that work is influencing the work you're doing now. Do you still consider yourself a scholar? Are you still doing sort of your own work, like your own sort of research work? Kind of how do you sort of think about all of that in your career in life?
Yeah, well, goodness, I don't even know what to call myself sometimes. So yeah, I honestly, I've struggled to self-define myself
Oh,
sometimes.
interesting. That's
But
interesting.
I think you have to know what you're talking about to be able to manage it. So that I do
Mm,
believe in. So, and I think you have to know the rules of the game to break them as well. So I
right.
think the fact that part of my background has been very traditional in that way, and I was a very good student following all the right paths and all of that, but then realized that they weren't really taking me to what I wanted to do. It wasn't for me to to be a PhD scholar and devote
Right.
my
Right.
life to one particular topic. And so, but I think I can challenge it because I know it, and it's very different to challenge it without having experienced it than having
Mm,
gone through those motions. So, um, but then I think there's a different part of your question about your own research projects and things like that. And yes, there are topics that fascinate me that I would love to do my own exhibitions on, that I would love to do
right.
publications on, and dive a little deeper on, and hopefully there's some opportunities for that to happen here. I think the reality of museum work as well is that we're so over focused on producing and production and the output that sometimes there's little space for that.
Right.
But one has to create it, because I think otherwise you create this distance with your
Yeah.
object of desire that
Yeah.
started it all, right?
Yeah.
So no, I try to cultivate that. I think how it manifests in the future, maybe and while I'm here at the museum, is yet to be seen. But I would, there's always pockets of research and ideas and things that I'm constantly pinning and writing down and saying this could be an amazing project, and then I leave it there for
Right.
for forever and then come back to it. And there's lots of things brewing in that way as well, always.
Well, I think that's a good way to kind of wrap up. I'll ask you the question that I use to end all of these that may or may not be related to what you're just talking about. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
I love that question. I my my diet in that way right now is pretty chaotic if I think of what I'm reading, because I read so many different formats again,
Yeah. Yeah.
that I don't take your question just about like what book are you reading, or like what is it that you're. So I read a lot of sort of professional architectural design, sort of like
Uh-huh.
journals and things like that. That's always on the list. And but I like getting recommendations from friends on books always. And the latest one that I got, so this is slightly cheating because I'm only a couple of pages into it, but a dear friend recommended a South Korean philosopher whose name I'm going to mispronounce, but his name is Byung-Chul Han, and he's South Korean, but he lives in Germany, and he's a cultural theorist, I would say, and he writes
Mm,
a lot about the contemporary condition and sort of like the situation we're in as humans, and like in a
mhm.
fast-paced sort of like late capitalistic society, and the psychological effects that is having on us. So I've picked up one of
Interesting.
his books. He has many, but this one is called The Burnout Society, and the jury's still out. I I have to finish it, but I did pick that one up, both because of the topic, but also because of who recommended it to me. So
Right.
I always like to think of that. And then I have two kids. I'm reading a lot of children's literature
Oh,
lately.
yeah, yeah,
And I have to add that in there because it's probably the biggest volume of things that I'm reading right now. And that's been a great rediscovery, like rediscovering classics that you read as a kid,
yeah.
and finding deeper messages and all of those. So it's a mixed bag, I suppose, is what I'm
Yeah.
reading.
No, I love that. And that's why just like you, that's why I asked this question, is because I love getting recommendations. And I know if I'm talking to somebody on the show that they're going to have good, good recommendations for books. And part of me was thinking you might say something like, I'm reading a lot of strategy documents right now or something. So I love that you still have time to kind of do this other reading. Maria, thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it, and really enjoyed kind of hearing how you think about all of this work. And next time I'm in New York, I'll give you a call so you can kill my dreams of taking your job.
Thank you so much, Jared. It was great talking to you. Thank you for having me.
This episode was recorded on August 19th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.